I never thought that things could get to this point in my family. Yes, my parents had problems, but it always seemed to me that it would remain at the level of domestic quarrels, habitual misunderstandings. It turned out that I greatly underestimated the depth of the cracks. When they filed for divorce, everything turned upside down. The atmosphere at home became so tense that it seemed as if the walls were saturated with this heaviness. Every conversation was like a minefield, one wrong word, and an explosion. The divorce was officially formalized quickly, but nothing ended there. The most unpleasant thing began later when the question of dividing property arose. It would seem that the parents are adults, they should agree, but we the children intervened. Me and my sister, we have different characters and views on life. She is always sharper, more emotional, likes to prove her point to the last. I'm used to looking for compromises, but I also have limits to my patience. At first we were talking about standard things, an apartment, a car, a summer house. At family gatherings, we discussed how best to divide the property to make it as fair as possible. Lawyers, papers, endless arguments. It seemed like everything was coming to a logical conclusion, and I was already hoping that at least some stability was ahead. But then one detail surfaced that changed everything. I accidentally overheard my father talking to our grandmother on the phone. He spoke quietly, but I understood the gist of it. My grandmother had given a large sum of money, and not just like that, but secretly only to my sister. At first I thought I had misheard, but then I decided to ask her directly. I naively expected her to confess. My sister pretended not to understand what I was talking about and turned the conversation into a joke. I felt like I was digging in the right direction, but there was not enough evidence. Irritation was growing inside. It was not the fact of the money itself that hurt me so much, but the fact that everything was kept secret. If this had been my grandmother's open decision, there would have been no questions. But the secret immediately gave a feeling of betrayal. I told my mother. At first she didn't believe me, but it was obvious that doubt had set in. A couple of days later the situation was fully revealed. It turned out that my grandmother had indeed transferred a fairly large sum of money to my sister's account. Officially, it was a gift. My sister didn't want to discuss it, and when the conversation went into a corner, a real scandal began. She shouted that it was her personal business, that my grandmother had made her own choice, and no one had the right to interfere. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the amount, but about trust. But words didn't matter. The more I talked, the more heated the situation became. My father took a strange position, as if it didn't concern him at all. He distanced himself, saying that let my grandmother decide for herself who to help. My mother, however, took it all painfully. For her it became further proof that there was no honesty in the family. It was the first time I saw her lose control so much. Her voice trembled when she said that justice had been destroyed, that now everyone would pull the blanket over themselves. I sat and watched all this as if from the outside. My sister and mother were arguing, my father was silent, and my grandmother tried not to show up at all. I felt like the world was collapsing right before my eyes. Just yesterday we were a family, albeit with our own problems, and today everyone was against everyone. The situation worsened when my sister said that she was not obliged to share at all. She openly said that she considered herself more worthy because she was the one always helping Grandma. In reality, this help consisted of rare visits, but Grandma seemed to perceive it as special devotion. I do not argue that my sister could really be caring when it was beneficial for her, but hearing to my face that I deserved nothing was hard. I noticed that my words about honesty and equality ceased to matter. Everything came down to money. Conversations about family, support, traditions, everything disappeared. Only numbers and grievances remained. I tried to remind them that we were one family, that it was stupid to destroy relationships because of money. But the more I tried to stop this chaos, the worse it became. At one point, I realized that I no longer recognized these people. My sister looked like a stranger. She argued with such fury, as if I were her enemy. My mother cried and accused my father of doing nothing. My father waved me off, repeating that he was tired of all this talk. I sat in this cycle and wondered, how did we get to this point? When did money become the most important thing? When did my grandmother, who always taught us to be friends, add fuel to the fire herself? I began to notice that even my own thoughts began to change. At some point, I no longer thought about justice. I thought about being deceived, that I was made to look like a fool who was not entitled to anything. These thoughts were dangerous, but I could not control them. That was when I first felt alienation. That feeling when you look at your loved ones and realize that you do not trust them, when every conversation seems like a trap, when you don't know what's true and what's just another game. That night I left home feeling like I didn't have a family anymore. We were still technically related, but inside I felt empty. After that night I tried to keep my distance for a few days. I worked late, avoided calls and messages, didn't want to dive into that chaos again. But the more I tried to distance myself, the more it pulled me back. My sister and mother didn't talk to each other directly. Instead, I found myself in the role of a go-between, which was the last thing I wanted. Every message was passed through me, as if I were a courier in a war between two camps. At first I thought the situation would calm down. They flared up, said too much, then cooled down. But it turned out that was only the beginning. My mother began to suspect that my sister had some more secret transfers from her grandmother. She started checking documents, asking about extracts, asking leading questions. My sister responded with harshness and demonstrative silence. It looked like an open defense. One day, my mother brought old papers and threw them on the table in front of me. Among them was a copy of the will my grandmother had drawn up several years ago. In it, the property was divided equally between me and my sister. My mother said that now she was sure that my grandmother had changed everything and trusted my sister more. I saw how this was tearing her apart from the inside. For her, it was not so much the inheritance that was important, but the very idea that her own mother was capable of going against equality. I didn't know what to answer. There was only one thing in my head: what if my mother was right? I remembered scenes where my grandmother openly admired my sister, saying that she was smart, tenacious, with character. I got the usual phrases about a calm, reliable boy. I didn't pay attention then, but now these words sounded completely different. A week later, there was another scandal. We all got together again, parents, grandmother, me and my sister. It seemed that the conversation would be conciliatory, but as soon as the topic of money came up, my sister exploded. She said that she was tired of making excuses, that my grandmother had the right to spend her money as she pleased, and if she wanted to help her specifically, then that was how it should be. My mother could not stand it and sharply declared that it was unfair, that my sister had deliberately manipulated my grandmother's feelings. The atmosphere instantly flared up. My sister screamed that everyone around is ungrateful. My mother accused her of greed. My father again distanced himself, sat on the phone and pretended that it did not concern him. And then my grandmother said a phrase that finally finished everyone off. I am not obliged to share with everyone equally. Everyone gets what they deserve. These words hung in the air like a sentence. I felt everything inside shrink. At that moment, it became clear that this was not a random gift, not a misunderstanding. This was a conscious choice. My sister smiled triumphantly. My mother burst into tears and left the room. My father sighed heavily but said nothing, and I sat and looked at my grandmother, trying to understand when exactly she had stopped seeing me as a grandson who could be trusted. After that evening, I completely lost the feeling of home. Every meeting turned into a theater where the roles were assigned in advance. My sister was the winner, my grandmother was a strict judge, my mother was the accuser, my father was an indifferent spectator. I was left with the role of the odd man out who was trying to stop the storm, but no one was listening to him. I noticed that I was starting to have strange thoughts. Sometimes I wanted to pack my things and go anywhere, just not to hear this endless noise. Sometimes, on the contrary, I wanted to prove that I was also worth something, that I could fight for my own. But every time I opened my mouth, they looked at me as if my words meant nothing. A couple of days later, my mother raised the topic again. She said that she was going to file a lawsuit to challenge the gift. She argued that my sister had taken advantage of my grandmother's weakness and persuaded her to transfer the money. I tried to explain that going to court would only aggravate the conflict, but she was adamant. Her eyes were burning with determination that I had not seen for a long time. When my sister found out about this, she threw another scandal. She screamed so loudly that the neighbors banged on the radiators. Her voice sounded not just anger, but hatred. She called my mother a traitor, me an envious person, and my father a coward. I looked at her and couldn't believe that this was my sister. It seemed as if I was looking at a completely different person. My grandmother began to come to the house rarely, but when she did come, she pretended that nothing had happened. She spoke to me dryly, as if we were neighbors, not relatives, but she greeted my sister with a smile and warmth. These contrasts tore me apart from the inside. I began to think that perhaps all this was not a coincidence. but the result of a long-standing line that I simply did not notice. Maybe I had always been second plan, it just hadn't been so obvious before. Now everything fell into place, and it became clear that the balance had been completely upset. One evening I came home and found a scene that seemed absurd. My sister and mother were sitting opposite each other, each with a stack of documents. They were exchanging accusations and laying papers on the table like cards in poker. I understood that this was not just an argument, but preparation for a real war. I tried to intervene, but I was pushed away again. My mother said that I was too soft and did not understand the seriousness of the situation. My sister smirked and said that I had no chance anyway. At that moment, I realized I was no longer perceived as an equal participant. I turned into an extra in a story where the main roles were taken by others. That night, I could not sleep for a long time. The same thought was ringing in my head. If we continue down this path, we will never be able to be a family. Even if the court decides in favor of my mother, even if the money is returned, the trust has already been destroyed. And for the first time, I thought, is it worth fighting at all? Or would it be better to step aside and build my own life separately, without these endless scandals and accusations? I was sure that things couldn't get any worse after that dinner, but I was wrong. Things spun much faster than I expected. Mom actually went and hired a lawyer. At first, she didn't tell anyone, just quietly collected all the papers she could find. Old bank transfers, my grandmother's medical records, which showed that she was not in the best condition, even copies of letters and messages that my sister had written to her. When I realized that Mom was seriously going to court, I felt sick. My sister, of course, found out. She has a special talent for finding out everything that happens behind her back. She rushed to my house in a rage and screamed that Mom was trying to rip her off blind. The irony was off the charts. After all, she was the one who received the secret transfer, but somehow in her head she was the victim. We had an argument right there in my kitchen, and it was the first time in my life. I'm not proud of it, but I snapped and told her to her face that she had turned into a greedy stranger. She stormed out of the apartment and slammed the door so hard my windows rattled. A week later, my sister was officially served with a summons. That same night, she sent me a screenshot on my phone and a text at 3 a.m. "You better pray you don't get dragged into this, because I'm burning this place down if I lose." I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that my own sister was now threatening me for money. From that moment on, everything became public. Family squabbles that used to be discussed in whispers in the kitchen were now being discussed by lawyers, judges, and their neighbors. Dad, as usual, tried to stay out of it, that's his style. But people started asking questions. Why is your ex-wife suing your daughter? That was the headline I saw in my head, and it was a disgrace to the entire city. My grandmother, on the other hand, acted like nothing was happening. She kept inviting my sister over for dinner, pretending everything was fine and completely ignoring me and my mother. It felt like she had openly chosen a side and didn't even care how it looked. Honestly, it hurt more than any amount of money. I used to be close to her. She taught me how to ride a bike, came to my baseball games, and now she couldn't even look me in the eye. The trial dragged on for months. The lawyers dug up every little detail. My mother's lawyer claimed that my sister had manipulated my grandmother and taken advantage of her weakness. My sister's lawyer painted my mother as an embittered woman who couldn't come to terms with the divorce and was looking for a reason to get revenge. It was dirty and disgusting. Sitting in a courtroom and watching strangers pick apart your family was the most surreal experience of my life. I didn't want to take sides, but the situation forced me to. Every time I tried to talk about family and how we can work this out, I was met with rolling eyes. To my mom, I was a naive boy. To my sister, I was a traitor. Dad said, "Sit quietly and keep your head down," but that was easy for him to say, not the one being dragged in for questioning. The worst part was that people around us started looking at us differently. Neighbors who used to smile and wave now looked at us like they were watching another episode of a reality show. At work, a guy asked if the rumors about Grandma's money were true. I just wanted to disappear into the ground. At one hearing, my sister burst into tears right in front of the judge. She claimed she was the only one who cared for Grandma. I sat there, clenching my fists, knowing that half of what she was saying was either exaggerated or outright lies. But I couldn't object, it wasn't my place, and the judge hadn't asked me. Still, watching her twist the story to her advantage was unbearable. Gradually, the relationships with each member of the family began to crumble at the seams. Mom was completely drowning in anger and resentment. My sister was greedy. Grandma was living in denial. and Dad pretended to be above it all, when in fact he was simply afraid to get involved. I felt like a man who had been sucked into someone else's disaster, but he couldn't leave because it was his family. One evening, my grandmother called me. We hadn't spoken in months. She sounded calm, almost indifferent, as if nothing had happened. She said she didn't understand why I was so upset and that I needed to learn to accept that life isn't always fair. I wanted to scream, but instead I just sat there, clutching the phone, and realized that in her eyes I was a problem, just because I refused to play by her rules. And that's when I realized, this can't be fixed. No amount of talking, explaining, or hopping will bring back what we've lost. We crossed the line. As soon as money and lawyers got involved, we stopped being a family. We became adversaries. Honestly, I don't even know what the judge will decide in the end. I don't care anymore. The main thing is that I lost my sister, my grandmother, and maybe even my parents. And one question still haunts me. Is all this really about money, or is this just the final push that showed how broken we've been for a long time? The trial lasted more than 6 months. All this time I lived as if in some kind of fog. Work in the morning, calls from lawyers in the evening, rare conversations with my mother that ended in tears or screams. My sister kept to herself, but regularly sent caustic messages, as if she wanted to hurt me on purpose. Dad was still hiding behind his "I don't want to interfere," and my grandmother. My grandmother seemed to live in another reality, where everything that was happening did not concern her. The decision was made at the end of the summer. The court found the transfer legal. The documents were drawn up correctly, and it was impossible to prove pressure or manipulation. My sister kept the money. My mother sat next to me in the courtroom when the verdict was read, and I saw how her eyes literally went out. All her stubbornness, all her months of struggle, and all for nothing. She didn't say a word, she just gathered the papers and left. My sister, on the contrary, looked like she had won a championship. She smiled at her lawyer, fixed her hair, and even glanced at me with an expression as if I was always on the wrong side. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe at least a shadow of regret, an attempt to talk, but she wasn't there. For her, we hadn't been a family for a long time. After the trial, we no longer all got together, not even on holidays. Mom and Dad had completely separated, now not only legally but also in fact. They don't even say hello when they accidentally meet. My sister stopped communicating, blocked me on messengers. Grandma continued to invite her to dinners and post photos on social networks as if nothing had happened. Sometimes I caught myself going to her page and looking at these photos, and it cut to the heart. For a long time, I tried to understand where exactly we had gotten lost. It would have been easier if everything had broken in one day, but the truth is, the cracks were always there. Money and the trial just made them visible. It's like a house that seems to be standing, but when an earthquake happens, it becomes clear that the foundation was weak from the start. Mom, by the way, later said that she regretted that she had ever gone to court, that perhaps she should have just let the situation go and at least maintain some kind of relationship. But I saw her pain, and I understand that she couldn't do otherwise. It wasn't a fight for money, it was a fight for justice, which she wanted to show at least to herself. I also tried to let go. I signed up for a therapist, started working more, started spending time with friends, but inside there was still an empty space. When you have a family, you take it for granted, and then at some point it's gone, and you understand that you can't build it again. One time I accidentally met my sister in a shopping center. We just passed each other, we didn't even say hello, and you know the strangest thing is that I felt not anger but indifference, as if I had met a complete stranger. It was an unpleasant but honest realization. There is no longer family in the usual sense. Many friends advised to forget about it or stop digging into the past. But the thing is, it's impossible to forget. You carry it with you like a scar. It doesn't hurt every day, but it's always with you. If someone asked me what I've learned, I would say this: money itself doesn't destroy families. It just brings out what was already hidden. Envy, mistrust, resentment, all this was with us long before the transfer. Grandma's decision just lifted the lid, and everything burst out. Now I live separately, build my own life, and try to stay away from old dramas. I still talk to my mother, we meet on weekends. I rarely communicate with my father, but without conflicts. With my grandmother and sister, silence. Sometimes I think whether it's worth trying to reconnect. But every time I imagine how everything can return to the same arguments, I understand I'm not ready. The story did not end with a beautiful reconciliation. No one hugged, no one said sorry. We just went our separate ways. And maybe that's the truth of adulthood. Sometimes you can't save your family, no matter how hard you try. Sometimes you lose it forever.